Here's a point that doesn't get made often enough in politics. We knew going into World War II that the Soviet Union was our enemy. So World War II was basically two English-speaking nations that follow in the tradition of John Locke against an entire continent of nations that followed the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now we can quibble with this characterization a little bit. For example, France was occupied. They didn't choose fascism the way, say, Italy and Germany chose fascism. But at the broad strokes, that was basically the story. Two English-speaking nations that worked in the tradition of John Locke and individual rights against an entire continent that chose Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the general will and forcing people to be free. If you didn't watch the first video on Populist Conservatism number 1, keep in mind that fascism is an intellectual descendant of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau really kicked off the tradition of continental political philosophy, and fascism was one of the inheritors of that. Mussolini and Giovanni Gentile were operating with this tradition, and those two literally wrote the book on fascism. And it wasn't just World War II where we see these two nations really stand out compared to the rest of Europe. The Industrial Revolution began in England well before it began anywhere else. The Enlightenment was really launched by three important events in English history. First, Isaac Newton creating the crown jewel of physics, the Principia Mathematica. Secondly, the Glorious Revolution, where in a completely bloodless revolution, England deposed the tyrannical King James II and replaced him with a constitutional monarchy of William and Mary. And third, when John Locke published his treatises on government and gave us the concept of a rational basis for natural rights. If you really want to understand how far ahead of the curve England and America are, the best way to do so is to compare them to their longtime rivals, France. In 330 years since England had their last revolution, and in the 250 years since the United States' one and only revolution, France has had 5 different republics, 2 different dictators named Napoleon, 2 restorations of the monarchy, and 1 Vichy occupation. And if you're inclined to think that the United States' switch from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution count as a revolution, well, I won't quibble with you on that, but then we need to recognize that France has actually had 13 different constitutions. And France, actually, by European standards, has been ahead of the curve. They've had a bunch of different republics in their past history, but France has had consistent republics since the start of the Third Republic in 1870. Most European nations did not get stable democracies until after World War II. So consider that. The United States has had a stable democracy for 250 years, and Europe didn't have stable democracies until after World War II. Why is England and its children so different from the rest of Europe? That's what this video is going to be about. The story begins in the early to mid 1500s when King Henry VIII of England was unable to produce an heir with his Spanish wife, Catherine of Aragon. So he went to the Pope to go and get an annulment. Now these annulments were actually pretty routine, at least if you were a king back then, and reasons like the inability to produce an heir would usually get you an annulment. But Henry ran into a complication. Catherine of Aragon was actually the aunt of Charles V, and Charles V was King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor. And Charles V had invaded Italy and essentially taken the Pope hostage. Granting a divorce to Henry would be a humiliation to Catherine of Aragon and also to Charles V. So the Pope refused to grant Henry his divorce, which led to Henry passing the Act of Supremacy in 1534. Now what the Act of Supremacy did is it made Henry VIII head of the church in England. It did not make England a Protestant nation. Henry was still attached to the Catholic Church, but it did grant Henry the authority over church matters in England. So this did 2 things. The first is that even though it didn't make England at the time a Protestant nation, it did allow Protestantism to flourish in England. And the second was that Henry wanted to assert his authority against the Catholic Church. And one of the ways he did that was by authorizing an English translation of the Bible. And what that meant was that for the first time, the general literate population could read the Bibles for themselves. Under Catholicism, only Latin translations were allowed, so there were relatively few people who could read and write in their own native language, let alone in Latin. The Catholic Church felt that letting ordinary people read the Bible would be dangerous, and in a sense, they were absolutely right. Eventually, England did become a Protestant nation, and they formed a church called the Anglican Church, which was basically a compromise between Protestantism and Catholicism. Externally, it kept the Catholic hierarchy and a lot of the Catholic rituals, but a lot of its theology was more Protestant. A grassroots movement started to spring up among the literate population that had been reading the Bible, and this group called themselves the Puritans because they felt that the Anglican Church was not pure enough. They needed to purify it. And one of the biggest things that they objected to was the position of bishop. Now, one of the most important Protestant beliefs is that everybody is equal in the eyes of God. There are no people to act as intercessors between you and God. There are no other people that can forgive your sins between you and God. Everyone is completely equal. And this Protestant sense that everyone is equal in the eyes of God was the first truly populist movement in all of history. Now, this is a video series on populist conservatism, and the Puritans were the first truly populist movement in human history, so it's worth taking a little bit of time to see what motivated them. So I'm going to give 3 passages from the Bible. These passages are more about the general equality of human beings and not specifically about their beef with the Anglican Church. The first is Genesis 1:26 and 1:27. And I'm going to use the King James because that's what the Puritans themselves used. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. This passage gives rise to the concept of the Imago Dei, which is a Latin term. Imago is Latin for image, and Dei means God or deity. And the concept of the Imago Dei is so fundamental to Christianity. There are other religions where the rulers are often considered to be gods or somehow superior, and yet for humans, every single human being, male and female, are all made in the image of God. They're all made with equal dignity and equal value. In 479 AD, Gregory of Nyssa invoked Genesis 1:26 and 27 against slavery. He was the first person in human history to oppose slavery, and he specifically invokes the Imago Dei. He says in that sermon, "What utter folly to believe that you could be the master of the image of God." The second passage is Galatians 3:28, which is another famous passage from the Bible. It says, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." So this is another important example of Christianity putting every single person all on the exact same level. But the one that I like best is very similar to it, which is Colossians 3:11. It says, "Where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all." What's great about the passage in Colossians is that Paul is essentially escalating the concept of radical equality through different stages. He starts out with Greek nor Jew, and that was fairly uncontroversial. Jesus himself had affirmed that. The second is erasing the divisions between circumcised and uncircumcised. Now that may seem very random to modern readers, but it's actually really important once you understand the cultural context. The Jews, of course, had to be circumcised, and Gentiles did not. And that set up a conflict which is known as the conflict at Antioch. In this conflict, Peter had been freely eating and living with and engaging with Gentiles. But as soon as other Jews who had become Christians came around, he basically abandoned his Gentile friends and began eating with them in a way that kept the Jewish law. So there's 2 ways to read that. The first is whether or not Christians are under the Jewish law, and I think it's pretty clear from Jesus' time that they are not. Instead, I think it should be seen as an incident of cultural snobbery. And I'll use a modern analogy. Think back to the 1950s when the United States was starting to integrate. Imagine that there was some person, we'll call him Peter, who had a lot of black friends and hung out with all his black friends. But then all of a sudden his rich white country club friends showed up, and so he ditched his black friends and hung out with his white country club friends. That's basically what Peter was doing. Another modern analogy is you can think of Christianity as a musical artist. Sometimes people discover a musical artist before they get famous, and they kind of become musical snobs about it compared to everyone else who jumps on the bandwagon after they become famous. And so from Peter's perspective, as a Jew, he had earned the right to be in sort of the hardcore early Jewish followers as opposed to the bandwagoning Gentiles. And so Paul was striking down that division among Christians. And then Paul escalates the conflict to another level, which is when he mentions barbarians and Scythians. Now the Scythians themselves were a type of barbarian. They were related to the steppe people like, Attila the Hun's clan. And that's important because Scythians are a separate ethnic group. So Paul is extending this concept of Christian equality to span different ethnic groups. And so what Paul is saying is, you may think that these people are barbarians, you may think they're contemptible, you may think they're uncivilized, but they have the same fundamental equality, dignity, and value that you do. And then finally, he escalates it to one more level, which is slave and free. So now that we know the Puritans' motivations, let's see how they came into conflict with their king. When King James I became King of England, the Puritans appealed to him in the hopes of reforming the church, and in particular getting rid of the position of bishop. But King James denied their petition, and he did so with what became a slogan of his: no bishop, no king. And the idea is that if bishops were dragged down to the level of ordinary people, then it wouldn't be long before kings were dragged down to the level of ordinary people. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Although it wasn't King James who was the victim of this conflict, but his son, Charles. 140 years before the French put their king on trial for treason, found him guilty and beheaded him, formed a republic which proved to be unstable, and then collapsed into the dictatorship of a brilliant military leader, the English did the exact same thing. But in order to understand that, you have to have a good feel for the politics of Europe in the early 1600s. Now, at this time, Europe had bodies like Parliament in England and the Estates General in France. So the kings were in this weird state. They didn't have absolute power, but it also wasn't a constitutional monarchy. Instead, power tended to ebb and flow between these two bodies. And if you read European history, it's always so funny as an outsider to do it, because all these European kings are all obsessed with making their name by fighting wars against their neighbors. But as a reader, you know exactly what's going to happen. One, they're probably not going to achieve a decisive victory, and two, they're going to come close to bankrupting their country, so in order to make the war effort go, and then in order to pay afterwards, they're going to have to go begging to Parliament or the Estates General for more money. And so as a reader, you're like, why couldn't these kings figure it out and just adopt the policy of splendid isolationism, never call Parliament or Estates General to meet, never go begging for money because you're not fighting any wars, and just take absolute power? But for some reason, they just could not figure this out, or at least they had a lot of trouble figuring this out. The French were the first to figure this out. In 1614, the French King Louis XIII called the Estates General to meet for what would be the last time for 175 years. After that, the king's chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, had the fortified castles of the French nobility destroyed. Now between that and a variety of other measures, they were able to weaken the French nobility enough for the French kings to claim absolute power, including the power to levy new taxes. This process culminated with King Louis XIV, the Sun King, who was the greatest of Europe's absolute monarchs. Now the French nobility hated Cardinal Richelieu after that. He took their power away from them. And he became the main villain in Alexander Dumas's classic, The Three Musketeers. And the lesson, as always, is that powerful men can defeat their enemies, but they can't defeat the novelists. Now, Alexander Dumas was actually the grandson of a Haitian slave named Maria Cassette Dumas, and I'll give you one guess as to who his grandfather was. And Alexander Dumas's father, Thomas Alexander Dumas, rose to the rank of general in the French army during the French Revolution, and his life in the military inspired the background for many of Dumas's classic stories. So as a conservative, I'm obliged to be a critic of the French Revolution, but it really is astonishing how much opportunity they created before it all fell into violence and chaos and tyranny. On the other side of the English Channel, King Charles was trying to do the exact same thing. And after butting heads with Parliament a few times, he finally realized the trick of laying low, not fighting any wars, not spending a lot of money, and then you never have to call Parliament to meet. And if you never call Parliament to meet, then you can start to seize absolute power. And he would have gotten away with it, except for one fatal mistake. And that fatal mistake goes right back to King James and the whole no bishop, no king. King Charles knew that Puritanism was a threat to his authority. Now, here's a quick little theology lesson that plays a big role in the politics of the time. The Puritans were called Puritans because they wanted to purify the Anglican Church. They originally hoped to reform it. But they were actually from a denomination called Calvinists. Their beliefs were pure Calvinism. And there was another strand of Calvinism called Presbyterianism in Scotland. And they had very similar beliefs. I think they were arguably a little bit more moderate, but basically the same kind of radical equality. And so King Charles knew that the Presbyterians in Scotland were a threat to them, and he tried to Anglicanize the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. And in particular, he forced them to use the English Book of Common Prayer of the Anglican Church, and that essentially triggered a rebellion in Scotland. And that's when everything fell apart for King Charles. The war did not go well, and he didn't have access to enough funds without calling Parliament. So just like King Louis XVI in France, he had to call Parliament, and as soon as that happened, things got out of his control. The members of Parliament were furious that they hadn't been called in, I think, 11 years, and so they were not on Charles's side. And so this led to the First English Civil War. And the First English Civil War was essentially a race. Charles had the best army, but Parliament had control of London and the wealth of London, and they also had the navy. But they didn't really have a good army. So what Parliament had to do was they had to create their own army called the New Model Army. And so the war was essentially a race. Could they scale up and season this New Model Army before Charles was able to conquer them? And it turns out they were able to. And so they made peace with Charles for a while, but then a second civil war broke out. And it was after the second civil war that they realized that they couldn't make peace with King Charles. They put him on trial for treason against the people, and that actually is pretty important. A lot of kings, of course, claim that they are the divine ruler, but he was put on trial for treason against the people. So the idea was that the king was a servant of the people and not an instrument of God for his own royal person. And they found him guilty and beheaded him. After the execution of King Charles, they tried to form a republic, and they ran into essentially the same problem as the French did. There were too many different special interest groups competing, and they couldn't align enough to form a coherent common core. So here's a brief overview of the different factions. First, there were the Royalists, who were generally Anglicans. Now, the Royalists were expelled out of Parliament, and the Anglicans were expelled out of Parliament, and many of them fled to Catholic Ireland because they were two groups that had in common wanting to support their king. Other Royalists decided to pledge fealty to the new government and then basically just lay low and try to wait it out. The second major group was moderate Puritans, and they dominated Parliament after the Anglicans were expelled. And they were opposed to the king, and they were opposed to the nobility. But they favored the gentry, and they favored the wealthy business and commercial classes. They did not favor the commoners as much. So in terms of the French Revolution, you could think of them as the Girondins. And the third group was a much more populist group, and they were found mainly in the New Model Army. The New Model Army was really important because it was really the first power base that common people in England ever participated in. One of the ways the nobility gained control was that they would only sparingly give military power to ordinary people, and the New Model Army really changed that. And so they were really a flourishing of populist equality. One of the most interesting groups within the New Model Army was the Levelers. And like a lot of groups, their name was originally a slur against them. They were accused of wanting to level all the hierarchies in society. And so it's hard to understand how leveling hierarchy is a slur to modern ears. So it helps to get back into the mindset of people in early modern history. And throughout the Middle Ages, through the early modern period of history, the Catholic Church and then the Anglican Church had been preaching a concept called the Great Chain of Being, and it was a divinely ordained hierarchy. It had God at the top, then angels, then humans, then animals, then plants, and at the bottom was inanimate, non-living matter. And then within each group there was another level of hierarchy. So within the group of humans, there was the king at the top, then beneath the king there was the nobility, then beneath the nobility there was the gentry, and then other social classes all the way down to commoners at the bottom. Because the concept of the Great Chain of Being was deeply woven into medieval and early modern life, and because it was preached so often from the pulpits, whenever things started to go wrong or bad things happened, it was often blamed on a breakdown in the Great Chain of Being. If you're familiar with Shakespeare's Macbeth, then it is a very intentional meditation on what happens when you violate the Great Chain of Being by Shakespeare. So the play isn't just about a murder or a political coup, but instead it's about a theological rupture as the natural and divine order is turned upside down. In the play, Macbeth is the general of King Duncan's army, and he gets a prophecy from 3 witches that he will become king one day. And then, sort of egged on by his wife, he decides to make that prophecy come true. And so after Macbeth murders Duncan and becomes king, a whole bunch of strange supernatural events happen. Darkness becomes day, an owl kills a falcon, which is a lower bird, killing a bird higher up in the food chain, and Duncan's horses turn wild and begin to eat each other. So this shows the kind of chaos, systematic chaos that's unleashed when you don't follow the Great Chain of Being. However, the Levelers were apparently not Shakespeare fans, so they did not take this slur against the Great Chain of Being very seriously, and they embraced the name and really took it to heart. And this group of ordinary Christians and ordinary soldiers who lived 150 years before the French Revolution had many surprisingly modern ideas. So in a time in which only the wealthiest 2% or so of Englishmen could vote, they supported universal suffrage, or at least most of them did, and some of them even supported women's suffrage. They wanted to abolish the House of Lords and to have the House of Commons elected by this universal vote. They wanted to get rid of the king and institute a republic. They believed in both religious tolerance and in freedom of speech. And some of them even wanted to set up a welfare state to care for widows and orphans from the English Civil Wars. These modern ideas have meant that the Levelers have been claimed by both Marxists and libertarians. So Marxists claim them because they see the beginning of a revolt against hierarchy and the emergence of a class consciousness. And libertarians have claimed them because the Levelers were staunch defenders of the common law and of our natural rights. Now, the Levelers existed about 40 or 50 years before John Locke ever published his treatises on government, but the concept of rights had been floating around in England for a while, and to understand that, we need to look at the Magna Carta. If you're like me, you may have heard at some point that the Magna Carta was a sort of proto-Bill of Rights, and so you got really excited and looked it up and saw that it was just a bunch of really random items on the list with no coherence and no real semblance of rights, and just had to shake your head of the whole idea. But if you understand the historical context, then you can start to see the Magna Carta that way. So we have to go back all the way to 1215. And England at that time had a bad king named King John. And if you're wondering, yes, it's the same King John from the legends of Robin Hood. There's no evidence for Robin Hood, but King John was very real. And he was known for 3 things: losing wars, high taxes, and arbitrarily arresting people who disagreed with him. So a group of angry barons launched a rebellion against King John, and they forced him to sign a document with some seemingly inconsequential grievances, like prohibiting fishing traps on the River Thames and coming up with a standard serving size for ale across the kingdom. It wasn't until you got to clauses 38 to 40 that it became apparent why the document would become timeless. And those were the clauses that established due process. So they protected ordinary people from arbitrary arrests and imprisonment and gave them the right to a trial of their equals, a jury of their peers. However, the Magna Carta set an important precedent because it set the precedent that there were legal limits on the king's power. King John obviously didn't like that, so he immediately rescinded it and got the Pope to void it as well. And so the barons resumed their rebellion. and King John died of natural causes, and that pretty much brought an end to the rebellion. And this is where the Magna Carta actually becomes important. So King John did not have an adult male heir, and boy kings are always very weak and very fragile. But luckily, King John's son had a good regent. He realized the best path forward would be to make peace with the warring barons, so he reissued the Magna Carta as part of this reconciliation process, and it's been with England ever since. And so the Magna Carta, just like our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, has an inner logic within it, and this inner logic led to a gradual expansion of the classes of people that were protected. Once people got used to invoking their rights in one area, then they started to extend that concept to other areas, even if they weren't in the Magna Carta. And this is the environment from which John Locke drew his ideas on natural law and natural rights. Now, hopefully at this point, it should be clear that I'm a big fan of John Locke, but I'll take an 800-year-old tradition of people securing their rights against tyranny over the ideas that sprang out of one man's head, no matter how penetrating and insightful. Locke's 2 treatises on government are unquestionably works of philosophical genius. Very few human beings before or after Locke could have produced works of that quality. The Magna Carta is not a work of genius. It was just a list of things that angered a few rich barons. That's why due process is all the way down at numbers 38 to 40 on their list of grievances. There are 37 other things that irritated them more than King John's arbitrary arrests. However, over the years, decades, and then centuries, the pettier clauses were forgotten, but clauses 38 to 40 became more and more important. So no human being could have anticipated the downstream consequences of the Magna Carta. It evolved organically over time. The result of this evolutionary process is that the Magna Carta was invoked by the Levelers during the English Civil Wars, and it was invoked by both the American and French revolutionaries during their respective revolutions. The concept of due process, which arose in the Magna Carta, is found in every single Declaration of Human Rights. It's in the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution, it's in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in the French Revolution, and it's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. Now let's go and wrap up the English Revolution. Recall that there are 3 main groups. The first is the Anglican Royalists, some of whom had fled to Ireland, but some of them were just lying low and biding their time. And then we had the moderate Puritans who dominated Parliament. And then finally we had the New Model Army who represented the populist masses, and in particular was the Levelers. So there was no coherent core for ruling out of it. And so what happened is Oliver Cromwell, who was the leader of the New Model Army, eventually had to step in and become dictator. I mean, he never formally called himself that. He was Lord Protector of England, but he was a de facto dictator. And the reason why was these groups simply could not agree. And so one of the main sources of conflict was religious tolerance. So Parliament, the moderate members of Parliament who favored the gentry and the merchant classes, they were opposed to religious tolerance, but religious tolerance was an important principle of the Levelers and the Puritans of the New Model Army. And so what happened is Cromwell was defeated trying to pass legislation for religious tolerance, and that was the point where he basically became dictator. Now, Cromwell was not a Leveler. In fact, he would ultimately have the Levelers arrested and broken up by military force. Instead, out of these 3 groups, he basically didn't care what the Royalists wanted. He ignored them, but he tried to find a common core between the moderates in Parliament, who favored the gentry and the commercial interests, and the more populist-oriented Puritans of the New Model Army. And he couldn't really do it very well. So he had some ideas that were near and dear to the Levelers, like religious tolerance, and in other cases he kind of sided with the gentry. Cromwell was one of the better rulers in British history. He dismantled the old patronage system and turned Britain's administrative state into a meritocracy. He increased funding for education, again part of the Protestant push for universal literacy. He reformed the legal system to use English instead of Latin or Norman French. That was another idea he got from the Levelers, and it made the legal system more accessible to ordinary people. And he increased the funding for the Navy and was an important stepping stone for Britain's Navy becoming a major power. However, Cromwell also got into trouble, and there's a reason why Puritan has some negative connotations. So Cromwell banned both cockfighting and bear baiting, which today we would agree with, but did not make the people in his time very happy. He also heavily regulated the alehouses and shut a bunch of them down. So again, that didn't make people happy. And he banned people from playing sports on Sunday and the celebration of Christmas. Banning the celebration of Christmas may seem like a strange choice, given that Christians today get worked up about the war on Christmas every year, but the Puritans really did feel very strongly about it. It's not mentioned in the Bible when Jesus was born, so for them that was good evidence that we need to focus on Jesus' death and resurrection, not his birth. And they also agreed with a common criticism made today that Christmas was essentially a pagan holiday with a little Christian window dressing on top of it. The most serious accusation against Cromwell was his war against Catholic Ireland, which was extremely brutal. And this too has a parallel to the French Revolution, and for basically the exact same reason. Catholics in the French Revolution resisted the idea of moving to a republic, and the same thing was true during the English Revolution. And so Cromwell fought a very brutal war to essentially starve Catholic Ireland into submission. However, we need to get the story straight. After the Protestant Reformation, Catholics and Protestants fought repeatedly, and a lot of propaganda arose out of this. So we need to talk about the concept called Black Legend. It was a term coined to describe some of the Protestant propaganda about the Spanish Inquisition. When you sometimes hear these wild estimates of how many people were executed by the Inquisition, you'll sometimes hear numbers like 100,000, 200,000, and that's Black Legend. More careful historical scholarship shows that it was maybe 3,000 to 5,000, and it was over a period of 350 years. So the Spanish Inquisition executed maybe 10 or 15 people a year. Compare that to, say, the Reign of Terror in secular France, where they executed 40,000 people in 9 months. You'll see that the Spanish Inquisition was a major problem, but a much smaller problem. Black Legend started out as Protestant and Catholic propaganda against each other, but it has since been co-opted by atheists, so we need to separate the Black Legend from what Cromwell actually did in Ireland. And the historian John Morrell has been really central to this. John Morrell himself is an ordained Catholic priest, so he has no reason to try and shade his opinion on this. So Morrell spent 11 years tracking down over 1,200 pieces of Cromwell's writings from various libraries around the world. And from this he drew two conclusions. The first was that Cromwell believed persecution is counterproductive because it radicalizes moderates, and that's absolutely true. And the second is that Cromwell's goal was to stop the royalists. Now remember that after Cromwell took power, a lot of royalists fled to Catholic Ireland, and so they were the real target of Cromwell's war. Another point that needs to be made is ever since England went Protestant, it was the subject of constant threats to be forced back into Catholicism again. So very quickly, Spain sent their armada in 1588. Queen Mary heavily persecuted Protestants, including burning them at the stake, earning her the title Bloody Mary. Queen Elizabeth very skillfully held off these attempts by dangling the possibility of marrying a Catholic. And finally, King James II was a Catholic, and he tried to make England a Catholic nation again, and that was what led to the Glorious Revolution and a constitutional monarchy in England. But despite Black Legend, there was a reason for people of England to not like Cromwell. He and the New Model Army were a threat to the nobility in England, and his moralizing had alienated the common people. Despite these problems, he ruled successfully until he died, but after he died, it became clear that his son did not have the moxie to take his place, so Parliament invited Charles II to become ruler of England. I'm always tickled by this idea that Parliament went back to Charles' son and made him king. I can only imagine how that conversation must have gone. Hey, sorry I killed your dad, but if you want to be king, the job's yours. No hard feelings, right? But for the most part, Charles II really didn't have hard feelings, and in fact he'd signaled as such, which was part of the reason why he was invited to be king. And so because of that, he took relatively few reprisals against people involved in the English Civil Wars. However, Charles II did continue the steps that his father, Charles I, had taken of trying to gain absolute power, and so that constant battle between Parliament and the king had began again. It finally came to a head when James II became king because he was a Catholic and tried to make England Catholic, and that led to the Glorious Revolution and constitutional monarchy. So that's a lot more English history than you want, but the goal is to show that there was this real flowering of a vision of equality and a vision of democracy during this time period. However, it was only after the Glorious Revolution that it could finally be, at least in some measure, achieved. And so the Glorious Revolution led to religious tolerance, it led to the Enlightenment in England, it led to John Locke publishing his treatises on government. In fact, there's even a theory that the Levelers gave John Locke his concept of natural rights. And that's because John Locke's father was a Puritan who had served in the New Model Army, so he would have been exposed to the Levelers. I think it's an impossible theory to prove, and hopefully by now it's clear that England had this concept of liberty in the air, and it was finally able to flourish again after the Glorious Revolution. Now, in the time from when England went Protestant all the way to the Glorious Revolution, the Puritans were mostly persecuted, except for during this brief time of the English Civil Wars. And so a lot of them went to America. And if you follow American history, the real hotbed of revolutionary activity was initially in Boston. That was the site of the protests that led to the Boston Massacre, that was the site of the Boston Tea Party, and the war broke out in the Boston area with the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It then spread across the whole colonies, but it was the Puritan hotbed of Boston that was the real center of revolutionary activity in the early days. So, Puritans just really do not like kings.